Hello, this is Nathan with Nice at Dice. Perhaps you've heard of a popular board game called Pandemic. It's a cooperative game about protecting the world from being overrun by disease. Well, today I'm going to be looking at this game, Pandemic Rising Tide, sort of a younger cousin to Pandemic. It uses similar mechanisms, but the theme is completely different. In Pandemic Rising Tide, you are civil engineers in the Netherlands around the beginning of the industrial era, and you are working together to prevent the country from being overrun by floodwaters. I'm going to give you a quick overview of how the game works, and then I'll share some thoughts on it. So here's an example of what Rising Tide might look like when you first set it up. You have your 3-player tokens always start out on this province. You have a number of these Dike tokens set up in various places, and you have some of these water cubes in various regions. Some of that is predetermined, and then some of that happens randomly based on what cards come out of this Dikes fail deck at the beginning of the game. Each player also has a character card, such as this, which gives you some nice artwork, identifies the color of your player pawn, and gives you a special ability that you can use throughout the game. And then each player also has a starting hand of 3 player cards, which might look something like this. Each player card has the name of a region on it and the color of that region, and also a little map that gives you an idea where on the board that region is. You may have more or less than 3 cards at the beginning of the game, depending on the number of players. Now, I'm not going to go into every single rule of the game, but I want to give you a general overview of how the game is played. If you're familiar with basic Pandemic, I want to start by pointing out the 3 biggest differences between base Pandemic and Rising Tide. So in base Pandemic, you're trying to control the spread of disease. In this, you're trying to control the spread of water. So you only have one color of cube, these water cubes, and you start out with a few on the board, and they're going to spread, much like how diseases spread in Pandemic, but the way they spread is a little bit different. So there's always assumed to be water in the sea. You have a sea here, and you have a smaller sea here. And the water in the sea is represented by these 2 water cubes here and these 2 water cubes here. And so water can always spread inland from the sea. Within the land, the water can also spread from one region to another. Like, for example, this region started out with 2 cubes of water in it. And then these cubes, 1 cube of water each, spread into these regions from there. So the basic rule is, to understand it, if you have, for example, 3 cubes of water in a single region, like for example, if we had 3 cubes of water here, then at the end of each turn, you would check each of the adjacent regions and make sure that each of them has at least 2 cubes of water. If not, you will add cubes of water to bring it up to 2. So we would add 2 cubes of water to each of these adjacent regions. We wouldn't add anything here because this one already has 2 cubes of water. Then you would check each region that has 2 cubes of water and make sure that each adjacent region has at least 1 cube of water. So for example, we just added another cube of water to here, so we have 2 cubes of water. That means 1 water would flow into this adjacent region through here because it didn't have any water in it previously. And then the same thing would happen down here on this part of the map. Water would flow into this region from this region where you have 2 cubes of water. So that's basically how water moves throughout the game. You also have these brown pieces. These are dikes, and dikes can prevent the flow of water. So for example, even if there were 3 cubes of water here, if we had a dike right there, no water would flow from this region into this region. So that's an important thing to understand about the game. By use of these dikes, you can control where the water can end up. Now, it is possible that water can end up inland, without coming in through the ocean, and that happens as you draw from this deck of Dikes fail cards. So this deck has 2 cards for each region. So we draw a card from here, it gives us the name of this region. So we're going to identify this region on the map, which is right here. And because we drew this card, we have to degrade this region. So first of all, that means removing any dikes. So if there are any dikes, we have to remove 1 dike to degrade the region. But if we were to identify a region that didn't have any dikes, like for example, this region way over here in the corner is missing a dike from here. So if we were to degrade this region, which doesn't have any dikes, then that would mean adding a water token to it instead. So you can get water kind of randomly popping up inland in that way. So that's the first major difference, is the way that the water, the way that the cubes move in the game is different than the way the disease cubes from regular Pandemic work. And then, of course, the dikes, I guess, is probably the second biggest difference. The dikes being sort of a way to shore up a region so that it can degrade before actually getting those dangerous water cubes in there. And then also using them as a way to control where the water cubes can flow. So that's the second big difference. And the third and final big difference between this game and regular Pandemic is these structures. These are wind-powered water pumps, and you can build these in a region, and it's pretty cool how they work. So let's say we build one in this region here. Now at the end of each player's turn, before you draw from this deck and before water flows, you have the opportunity to pump some water out. So you can pump water out of the region where the pump is, or out of any region connected to it that has water in it. So you can trace a line from this pump to any other region and pump water out of that region instead. Now the rule is you can't cross a dike. So for example, I couldn't pump out of this region because to trace a line from here to there, I'd have to cross this dike right there. So I can't do that. And you can't pass an empty region. So for example, if these water weren't here in this region, I couldn't use this to pump out this water because I'd have to trace a line through a region with no water. So that doesn't work. But anywhere in here, I could pump water out of those regions. So that's a pretty cool thing. You can have up to 5 of these pumps on the board at any time. And once you get all 5 on there, you can really be pumping a lot of water out of the land at the end of each player's turn. So that's a pretty cool addition to the game. Now, assuming that you have not played the game or are not super familiar with the regular Pandemic, I'm going to go ahead and just kind of walk you through the basics of how this game works. So I've sort of returned it to the way it was set up in the beginning. And let's take a look at what a turn might look like in this game. So on your turn, you can take 4 actions. And I guess before I go any further, I should probably specify really what the objective of the game is. This is a cooperative game. Everybody's working together to accomplish the same goal. And the goal is to build these 4 hydraulic structures over here. Each of these structures needs to be built in a specific place. So for example, the red structure gets built right here in that red region. The yellow structure gets built over here in this yellow region. In order to build a structure, you need to have 5 cards with the matching color. So for example, here's 2 red cards. So if I had 3 more of these in my hand, I could use them to build this. So I just need to be in that region and use an action to discard my player cards and build that structure. Building the structures is important not only because it's how you win the game, but each time you build a structure, you get an immediate effect for building it. For example, for building the red structure, I would immediately add a dike all along the shore of these 5 regions here. So if some of these dikes were gone, they'd be replaced. At the very least, this dike will be replaced. So that would be the immediate benefit for building that red structure. So the timing of when you build each structure can really help you. But really, the overall objective is you have to build all 4 of them to win the game. You can lose the game in 2 ways. One is if you run out of water cubes. So you have a good number of water cubes, but they're going to come onto the board throughout the game. And if at any point you would have to place another water cube on the board and you have none left in the supply, then you have lost the game. The other way you can lose the game is if you run out of cards in the player deck. So these are the player cards. You're going to be drawing 2 as a part of each of your turns. And if you would ever need to draw cards from here and there are none left, then you have lost the game. So everybody's working together to try and win or lose the game together. So on your turn, you're going to have 4 actions. You can use those actions to do a variety of things. You can simply move. So let's say, for example, it's the green player's turn. You can move from one region to an adjacent region, like so. You can also sail. So you can discard a region. You can discard the card, any card. So let's say this card, for example, to move to that region. So I could discard this card from my hand and move all the way over to that region there. If I'm in that region and I want to move, I could discard the card for that region, if I have it, and then move anywhere on the map, any region I want. So those are 3 ways that you can move. You can also build a couple of things. You can build a dike. So you can use an action to build a dike. You can basically build a dike between the region you're in and any adjacent region. The only limitation is that you cannot build a dike in a region where there is water. However, if, for example, I wanted to build a dike here, there's water in this region, so I could not build the dike there. But if I step over into this region where there is no water, I could build a dike in that same spot. You can also build multiple dikes in the same spot if you like, so I can reinforce that dike with a second one basically. That's a separate action to do that, but that is also a possibility. You can use an action to build a windmill pump, like I said earlier. So the only limitation on that, you have to be in the region. You have to discard the card for that region to build that pump. In a similar way, you can discard the card for a particular region to build a port. Ports are good because once you have a port, you can literally travel from anywhere on the board to any port for one action. So they help a lot in you getting around the board. You can also share resources. So, for example, if I have the card for this region, and me and another player are both in that region, and for one action, I can give this card to that other player. Or for one action, that player can take that card from me. So we can share our cards in that way. There's also some event cards. Let me see if I can find an example of those real quick. Yeah, so this one, for example. This is called Emergency Sandbags. Event cards look like this. They have some kind of illustration, and they explain what they do. So, for example, this one says, skip the Dikes fail step this turn. So you can play these, generally speaking, you can play these cards at any time, on your turn, on someone else's turn. It doesn't take an action to play them, and they always give you some useful benefit. After you've taken your 4 actions, moving around the board, building things. Oh, also another essential thing that you can do is you can use an action to simply remove 1 water cube from the region you're in. So again, moving around the board, building things, removing water, swapping cards with other people as you're able. And of course you're trying to get 5 cards in your hand of a matching color, so you can use an action to build one of the 4 structures. After you've done all of that, you operate the pumps. So if there are pumps, so for example right here, you can operate this pump to remove 1 water from a region. So I could, for example, remove 1 water from that region. And you get to activate every pump on the board at this point in your turn. after you've taken your 4 actions. Then you're going to draw 2 cards from the player deck and add them to your hand. If you drew a storm card, then something bad happens, and I'll explain that in a moment. But before I explain how the storm card works, the next thing that you do after drawing player cards is you draw from this Dikes fail deck. So you draw a number of cards from here based on the number shown here on this chart. So right now we're on 2 at the beginning of the game, so we're going to draw 2 cards from here. So we'll draw these 2 cards, and then we'll need to degrade each of these regions. So the first region is right here. So we would degrade that. It has 1 dike, so we'll remove the dike. That's how we'll degrade that one. And then we need to do this region, which is right here. It's got a number of dikes, so we'll remove one of those dikes, and that's how we degrade that region. If there had already been all the dikes removed, then we would add water to that region, like so, as I explained earlier. Then these cards get discarded, and then we have to do the flow of water. So now we check every spot on the board where there's water, and we see if any water flows from that spot to another spot, as I explained earlier. At this point, the way the board is in its current state, no water is going to flow, and so then that would be the end of our turn, and we would move on to the next player's turn. Now let me go back and explain what the storm card does. So the storm card does 3 things. The first thing it does is it raises the sea level. So this goes up. The first couple of times this goes up, it makes no difference, but when it gets to 3, it's going to do 2 things. One, it's going to add 1 more water to each sea, which means that when water flows, it's going to flow in from the ocean much more quickly. So for example, if this region was still lacking a dike here, then once we have 3 cubes of water here, we would check and we would see, oh, this region only has 1 cube of water, and so since this has 3 and this has 1, we got to bump it up to 2, which means then in turn, we're going to check each adjacent region to that and make sure it has at least 1 water. So you can see how as the game progresses, the water is going to flow much more quickly, and it's going to go over a much wider area and be more difficult to control. So that's the first thing that happens with this card. The sea level rises. The second thing that happens is you have a major breach. So you pull the bottom card from the Dikes fail deck, and you identify what region that is, and then you degrade that region 3 times. So that happens to be this region over here. So the first time we degrade it, we'd remove this dike, and then the next 2 times we would add water to it. And then this goes to the discard pile. You pick up all the cards in the discard pile, shuffle them up, and then they go back on top of this deck. So now you're going to start working through the same cards again. Another small difference between this game and the base Pandemic is that in the base Pandemic, there's only 1 card for each city in both the player deck and in the Dikes fail deck. But in this game, there are actually 2 cards for each city in each of those decks. So that affects your strategy as well. That's basically how the game plays, and we'll go back up top and I'll give you my final thoughts on it. So what can I say about Pandemic Rising Tide? Well, to compare it to the base Pandemic game, it's very similar in its mechanisms. It has that same kind of tug of war between trying to manage the danger, trying to make progress towards your goals, and knowing you have a limited number of turns to accomplish all of that, which is very exciting in play. It feels kind of like base Pandemic with 1 or 2 expansions added. They add the water pumps, they add the dikes. There's also, I didn't show this in my overview because I was just showing you the basics of the game, but they have some variants in the box that you can play with. One of those variants adds something called population, so it's a whole other set of cubes that you're trying to put on the board. So you're not only trying to hold back the water cubes, but you're trying to add these population cubes as well to repopulate certain parts of the country. And yeah, so with all of that, there's a lot in the box. There's the basic part of the game, which is still a little more complex than base Pandemic, and then you have these variants that you can add to ramp things up even more. My favorite thing about the game really is those water pumps, because that is a really cool mechanism. The more of them you get out on the board, the stronger that aspect of the game becomes. The fact that every one of those water pumps goes off as a part of each player's turn really kind of creates a sense of sort of building an engine. We have this problem with the water coming in, and we're building an engine that's going to help us mitigate that threat. And I always enjoy engine building in any kind of game. That's one of my favorite mechanisms in a game. So to have a little bit of that injected into Pandemic is pretty cool. I like that. My least favorite thing about the game is the Dikes. I like the idea of the Dikes and the system of the Dikes, but having to put out those 50 Dikes at the beginning of the game as part of your setup is just one more thing that you have to do to set up the game, and it just adds a little bit of time and complexity for you to get into the game and actually get playing. So I don't really care for that. I find that a little bit annoying, but overall I don't think it detracts too much from the game. So would I recommend this game? Well, I would never hesitate to recommend Pandemic to anyone who's interested in a cooperative board game. I think Pandemic is a really fun game and a really great design. Having said that, since this game is kind of like Pandemic with a couple of expansions, I don't think I would recommend it to anyone who hasn't played the base Pandemic. But if you have played Pandemic with maybe 1 or 2 expansions and you want something a little different, then yeah, definitely. Or if the theme just especially appeals to you. But I would still kind of recommend at least play the base Pandemic without any expansions before you jump into this, because it does ramp up the complexity and the difficulty a little bit. So overall, I would definitely recommend this game. I think Pandemic Rising Tide is a really fun take on that system. And yeah, definitely gets a thumbs up from me. So thank you for watching. Again, I'm Nathan with Nice at Dice, and you enjoy the rest of your day.